So I want to briefly take a look at the lives of Hindu women and kind of ask some questions about how we view ethics in relation to religion, and how do we deal with issues of diversity and issues of kind of regional autonomy, and yet also human rights, because there are reform movements within Hinduism that are rooted in the problems for Hindu women, and we'll talk about those in the reform section. But this is a complex issue, I think, that could use a few minutes of its own. So quite honestly, most young women within the Hindu culture will marry. Obviously there's some modern families who women go out and have careers and things like that, but even to this day, the focus is on marriage, motherhood, taking care of the home. These are the key points for many Hindus. That's all there is for the life of a woman. The problem has been that women are seen as less valuable than men, and so when abortion was legalized in 1994, when abortion was legalized, they began to see an uptick of gender testing for the sake of selective abortions, and girls were being aborted at a much higher rate. So in 1994 they outlawed that, but that still goes on. It's really hard, as long as abortion is legal, it's hard to really stop them from doing that. So there's a challenge for them in that sense, because quite frankly, again, women are often seen in this context as less valuable than men. Because of that, at least other problems, divorced and widowed women are considered very unlucky. Remarriage is a rare thing, and so many of them, there's a high suicide rate, and many of them have a kind of socially acceptable vein for suicide that we will talk about in certain Hindu communities, and historically, going back to some of their chief stories. We'll talk about that briefly as well. I want to look at, to be fair, you can't say that everything in the tradition itself and the stories themselves are in a sense hateful or kind of belittling of women. In the story of the Mahabharata, Draupadi is one of the heroes, and when others try to kind of shame her and hurt her, it's Krishna, or the embodiment of the god Vishnu, who protects her. She's seen as a very virtuous figure in the story. In her role in the story is a role of virtue, and of course there are goddesses that are key. There are devotees to goddesses. On the flip side, you have, one of your key figures says at one point, no creature is more sinful than woman. Women are the root of all evil. She is poison, she is a snake, she is a fire. But at the same time it says righteousness of men depends on women. All pleasures and enjoyments depend on women. So there's this tension within the tradition. But I think the most difficult thing is remembering the kind of difficulties for widows and divorced women. Is to think about the story that we saw in the Mahabharata of Madri and Pandu. How does Madri show her devotion to Pandu? Well, he dies and he's put on a burial pyre, and what does she do? Sati. This is she throws herself on his burial fire. Because of this story, in many instances, in many places, in many times throughout history, and because widows and divorced women, but especially widows, are seen as very unlucky, women were frequently pressured, sometimes even drugged and forced to be thrown onto their husbands' burial pyres, because this was seen as the kind of the only honorable choice. And this raises one of those kind of difficult ethical questions: is what do you do? How does power act in relation to culture? Because sati was legal in India until the British Empire took control, and it was really the pressure placed on the British government by most of the time British Christian missionaries to put a stop to this practice, to make it illegal. Obviously that makes it hard to actually stop a woman with a will to do it from doing it, but because how are you going to punish her? What that really makes illegal in many ways is the oppression of individual women, the drugging or forcing of a woman to be thrown onto her husband's burial pyre. But realize that's a sticky question. It's not an easy question for many people who, when we're averse to colonialism and any form of oppression and the kind of subversion of local custom to conquering custom, and yet here we had women with very few rights and very few protections being forced to kill themselves as part of their husband's burial rituals, and it's the outside power, the colonial power, that puts an end to that practice. Just keep in mind that the practice is not necessarily prescribed by the religion, but there are elements of the religion that do make it, in many instances, at many times and places, the only viable option, especially for a woman who's widowed and feels totally destitute. In some sense, this is a way to save her honor.